All right. In this last video demonstration, we're going to be looking at how to add color and texture to a given model or structure inside of Blender. So we're going to first look at how to add and change material properties for a model. And materials is another way of talking about the base colors and shaders that can be applied to a surface. So we'll start with that so you can get kind of familiar with how Blender works with color, and then we'll move into texture. So let's start with color. All right. So first things first, let's establish our model in the scene. We want to make sure it's selected. So I'm going to select my character. And I'm going to switch off my camera viewport. So I'm just going to hit 0 on the number pad to turn that off for now. And to find our properties for working with color, again, this is another property tool. So we need to go to our property panel over on the right. Going to get really familiar with this after this exercise. So to work with material, we need to use the property that looks like an orange sphere. And this one will pull up material properties. And when you click on the little orange sphere icon, again, make sure that you have your object, your character 3D model selected when you do this. Or at least some kind of 3D form inside of your scene. All right, so once you got that grabbed, now when we go into the material area, it doesn't show anything right now. It actually has a button that says New. Every object initially in Blender will start off without a base material attached to it. That being said, it is important and even pivotal that you always apply a base material to every physical object that's supposed to show in Blender. Always apply a base material. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the New button right here. And when I hit New, it adds a generic material to the object. It might even change the shading of the object that you're currently looking at in your screens ever so slightly. But it gives it a basic material. So here is what happens with the material options to edit in this view. So first off, in the property for material, we have a preview window, which shows us basically a sphere and a checkerboard kind of room, or into a checkerboard corner of a room. Again, to preview how your material looks, how it's shiny, if it's bumpy, what color it is, if it reflects light, if it has transparency. All of that will be visible in this little preview window when we change settings. It does have a little strip of icons that run vertically next to the preview window, so that you can preview your shader changes on different shaped objects. To see how it affects a different type of object. The most basic is the sphere, the cube, and the monkey. The monkey gives you an idea of how your color affects a organic shape, right? Like a non-normative form. And sometimes that's useful to understand how color or how light wraps around a kind of very kind of rounded or non-ordinary shape to preview it on. So I'm going to leave that on. And let's look at some of the properties we can change. So we'll start off with the first one down here that says diffuse. So the diffuse property for a material, this is the base color, is what you can think of it as. So with the color bar that's set for diffuse, that's this white bar right below where it says diffuse, you can click on that and we can change the base color of our model using that. Using the little color wheel that it pops up for us. Kind of like we did when we were changing the light color system, it uses the same kind of operating tool to do that. So we can very quickly change a base color for our model if we need to. And again, this is a universal change, so it colors the entire model, okay? So just be aware of that when you're playing with these this little color wheel. All right. So that's diffuse. Now under the color bar, there's actually an intensity slider for diffuse that you can adjust for the intensity of the color. So it can be rolled all the way to 0, which makes your model look black, or you can push it all the way up to brighten the color. overall. And that's just using the little intensity slider for diffusion. Now, if we go below that, our next property is called specular. Specular is what controls the actual highlights that appear, bless you, on your model. And specular, you can change the color for, but natural highlights generally are based on a white light source, which again can be altered if you change the lighting system in Blender. But specular, again, controls the amplification of highlights on your model. So it can be very shiny if you push the intensity all the way up. Or if you knock it all the way down, it will take out all the shine off your model to make kind of a very flat, kind of painterly surface, which is what my model looks like right now. Very flat shaded, no shine whatsoever. And that's because my intensity for specular is all the way down. I'm going to go ahead and pull it back up to about 0.5 or so. All right. So that's basic specular adjustment. Highlights is what you can think of that as. You can also adjust the hardness factor for highlights, or for specular. Down below it, it has a big slider that you can push and pull on. And so this will either amplify your highlights to be very large, or when you have a small number for hardness, or if you push it down, it will sharpen up the hardness to only show in very tight, narrow areas. I think, yeah, hardness can be pushed all the way to 511 for the value number. But standard is around 50 or 40. All right, so that's specular. Let's skip down to the section called transparency. Transparency is turned off automatically, so if you check the little gray box for it, it will make it active. And underneath transparency, you have several options. Like you can turn on Z transparency, which is kind of like a preview. Ray traced will give you a more accurate transparency control over your object. And when you turn that on, there are a couple basic sliders that you can play with. The first one, called alpha, is the one that actually adjusts the transparency level of your object. So if you adjust the alpha slider, that will make your object more transparent. Now, when you're viewing it inside of the Blender preview window, if you have material shader preview turned on, your object just starts becoming very bright orange to indicate that it's becoming more transparent. You can switch to rendered for your preview down below, and to get a better idea of how transparency is actually affecting your model inside of your scene. Again, remember, it takes a minute for it to render this because of using ray tracing for transparency can take longer to make it more accurate. And that's what ray trace rendering does. But my transparency is about 0.4, and you can see kind of through my model now into the background behind it. And that's kind of what, that's what the basic alpha slider does. You can also adjust specular, so if you want to create transparency over the specular regions of your model, you can also change that if you want to. And it also gives you control over gloss. If you want to adjust how glossy the surface is for the shininess level of the actual transparency that you're working with. You can change that or reduce that number. Again, it will take it a minute to render that. If you're in Z transparency for preview, it might render a little faster. It does cut off a lot of your extra options, but it does render a lot faster. All right, so that's playing with transparency. So anytime you need to make an object that appears see-through, like glass, clouds, smoke, water, any of that kind of stuff, you can use the transparency option for a selected object. All right, now I'm going to turn off transparency, so I'm just going to uncheck that box for now. And we're going to slide down to the option that says mirror. And I'm going to check the box for mirror. And I'm actually going to exit out of render mode on my screen because it renders every time you change something. So it can take a long time to render. But I'm going to switch it back to material mode. And I'm going to turn on mirror. And mirror is what gives your object reflection. So if you want it to be like a reflective, glassy, metal type surface, you can adjust it with mirror. And the basic options you get under mirror are things like reflectivity. Reflectivity is what immediately changes the way that your object can reflect its environment. So in my preview window of my monkey over here, my monkey is currently showing me this very kind of reflected surface. As I up the reflectivity value or amp that up, more and more of the checkerboard surface reflects in the monkey, which shows me what it's actually helping my model do. Now, your model can only reflect what's in the environment. So if you don't have any other objects around your shape or your form, it's not going to have much to reflect except the cyclorama, right? So if I switch back to rendered mode on my screen, it will show me reflection changes to my overall model, but it's only going to be reflecting, again, nearby surfaces. And because my model is a different color than my background, I can immediately see the differences of it reflecting parts of the cyclorama onto parts of my model. And if I switch out of quad view for a second to blow it up on screen so you can kind of see what's happening with the reflection, you can see how it's picking it up on different regions of my model, the colors from the cyclorama. Those little highlight gray shades on the lower half of the body. All of that is reflected surface material. And that's just by changing the basic reflectivity attribute for mirror. You can change other things that are listed here, like depth or maximum distance. You can even change the gloss factor, so if you want to make it less of a shiny kind of preview, you can change that. But they will, again, it'll kind of suck up preview as you add more of those functions under reflectivity. So the very basic one that I want you to be able to change if you need to is just the reflectivity slider. That's it. That's your most basic changer to make it clear what's being done. All right. So I'm going to turn off mirror to disengage that thing. And I'll just restore my model back to its regular shading attributes. All right. Now those are the very basic properties that you can change for a model in here. That I'm not going to really take you into the other ones. These will actually translate out if you export your model. So they're the most effective to use and the most basic in terms of using them for whatever material you're trying to generate. And again, you can use any combination of those to create a different kind of surface material for your model. So if you need to make something that's more kind of gold-like, for instance, you need to make sure that you have a base diffusion color that's kind of, maybe yellowy orange. Again, gold is fairly reflective to a degree, depending on the type of surface you're using or material. So I might turn on mirror. Play around with it a little bit. Some people will actually have there's a link that I have on Blender in the exercise that you can go to a little cookbook page for how to make materials in Blender if you're trying to make something from scratch. Some of those are very interesting and kind of fun to play off of. So feel free to check those out, again, for making custom surfaces and those kinds of things. But this just gives you kind of a Kickstarter way to play with surface material for, again, a given form inside of Blender. All right. Oh yeah, part of mirroring, I mean, the other thing you can do is kind of get that to work with mirroring like the colors that you want to shine into your model. So gold doesn't really reflect or create white objects on the surface, or whatever the actual color of the object is in the environment, the gold overrides it. So changing like the color of the reflectivity can help sort of increase the effect of it, looking more like gold if it's more yellowed, or even more oranged in a way. Gives it more of that kind of gold-like appearance. All right. But again, different combinations of these attributes can help create different color groups to work on the surface of a model. All right. So that's playing around with just getting like a base material or a base color onto the surface of your object. So the next part that I want to talk about is actually taking like a 2D graphic image or photographic image and looking at ways to actually wrap that around the surface of your model. One quick thing before we hop into that, as far as rendering and looking at the work and coloring your model, there are ways to actually color selected areas on your model instead of just doing the whole thing. So I'm going to switch out of rendered viewing and go back to material shader real quick. And anytime that you want to color a specific region of your model in, we can actually use the edit mode feature in Blender to be able to manipulate that. Now I'm going to go ahead to do editing. I typically like to work with solid shading on my model so that it's not trying to constantly render. And I'm going to switch to edit mode. Your model should turn solid orange if it's selected. And what I'm going to do is unselect or deselect the entire model once you get into edit mode. And so you just hit A to deselect it. And what we're going to do is use our circle select tool to paint in a collection of polygons that we want to change the color of. So to set it up right, we need to change our selection method down below on our 3D menu bar to face selection, which is this third little cube icon, which has the little solid orange face on it. And so that does face selection. So once we got that on, cool. Now we're going to turn on our circle select tool. And you can do that by, again, if you're working in a single viewport, you can just go down to select from the lower menu and choose circle select. Or if you're just out here with your mouse, you can just hit C on the keyboard to shortcut to it. And then what I want you to do is just click and drag and paint over an area that you want to change the color of. Now remember, when the circle select tool is active, you can't do anything else in Blender until you deactivate the tool. Once you're done selecting, if you need to like rotate your model, for instance, you can hit escape to turn the tool off temporarily. And then we can actually rotate our scene if we need to at that time. And then we can hit C again to turn the tool back on. If you want to be able to zoom in better on your model, you might want to hit the number 5 on your number pad to switch out of perspective distorted view and switch to orthographic. And that actually allows you to zoom in much, much closer towards your model for editing details. And again, that's just hitting the number 5 on your number pad to switch out of perspective distortion. And again, just make like a quick selection, and then we're going to adjust it here. So once you got something colored in, cool. Here are the next steps that we'll work with. So I'm going to deactivate my circle select tool, hit escape to do that. And with this current selection up, we're going to go back to our material property over on the right and scroll up to the top of your material properties window or area. And notice in there it has a little list with the first material you added with a little sphere next to it, and it'll say probably just material next to it. So in this little area over to the right, there's a little plus sign and a minus sign. The minus will delete whatever current material you've created. The plus sign will create a brand new one that you can use to assign to a part of your model. So let's hit the plus. And this will start us off with a fresh material. Go ahead and hit new down below. And if you want to, you can change the diffuse color down here just to see what it'll do. And pick something that's opposite of whatever color you currently have on your model. And slide back up and click on the button near the top of your material properties that says Assign. So it's right next to Assign, Select, and Deselect. Use Assign. When you click on Assign, it automatically takes whatever new material you just created and apply it to the selected region on screen. So let's see what we've done. Let's exit edit mode for a minute. So just hit Tab. Make sure your mouse is in your window, your edit window. And you should notice immediately a change to your model based on the coloring that you just did. And so this is how you can actually apply different colors inside of Blender to specific regions. This tool only really works based on the number of polygons you have available to paint on. So the less detailed the surface, the more kind of rigid the coloring work will look. But this is called polygon painting or vertex painting, basically. But you can keep doing this on your model all day, selecting another region, painting it in, and adding more materials to your object. Now again, anything that you've created, if you don't like the material you've made, you can always go back to the top of your material window and select it from the little material list, and then hit the minus sign over on the right to get rid of it. All right. Now, just wanted to make sure I got that out of the way before I forget. Now let's look back. Now what I want to do now is work on applying a 2D texture to the surface. So what you need to have to do this part of the exercise, even if you're just practicing, is some sort of 2D photographic image on the computer somewhere. If you have not downloaded one, just quickly get on the web and look for a free 2D texture or a free texture. If you want to work it out even better, like free seamless textures is even a better way to look when you're trying to find something that can wrap around a model. Seamless textures will actually tile better when you multiply them around an object. So often those look really good in terms of wrapping around without showing edges. So I'm going to grab, let's see, I'm going to grab this one here that kind of looks like shag carpet. It's kind of fun. And when you're grabbing textures, remember when you're downloading stuff like that, look for stuff that has a good pixel resolution. Anywhere like above 1,000 is okay, is pretty good actually, so not a bad place to start. But I'm going to grab this one that I have right here and just pull it to my desktop real quick. Make sure to keep track of textures that you download. Always know where you get them from. And when you get textures, make sure you keep them in your folder structure for your project. So I have a folder for textures for my project, so I'm just going to drop it in there. And the reason that's important is that Blender does keep track of your texture files, okay? It needs them to be able to pull them back up on your model when you reopen your file later down the line. So always make sure that you have that texture saved with your project somewhere. It only links to it. It does not add it to the Blender file. All right. So I just put it in there. And now I'm going to go back to Blender. And with my figure model selected, what I'm going to do next is actually go to the texture property. Quick thing to know, any object that you have in here must have a material assigned to it first before you can add a texture, okay? Make sure that you get that right whenever you're designing in here. So always have a basic material assigned under the orange sphere for material properties before you add a texture under the texture property, okay? All right, so the texture property is right next to materials. It's the red and white checker icon. And it looks just like material in terms of the sense that it's kind of an empty menu until you hit new. And here are the things we're going to change. So number one in here, we're going to go to type. Type should be set to image or movie to indicate what kind of texture you can wrap around your object. If we slide down to where it says image down below, we want to use the button that says open. And this is where we're going to set our image to appear. So when you go to open, it pulls up the directory browser in Blender, and you just want to navigate to wherever your stuff is stored. So if it's on your portable drive, it's going to appear in the system menu. If it's on your desktop, come to the system bookmarks and go inside there and navigate to your texture. Select it and go to open image. All right, so that's the first step. Now, after that, typically what I like to do on a model is if you don't tell Blender to do anything specific with this texture, it is going to wrap around it in a default manner that may look very ugly. For instance, if you switch, we can try and look at it right now. If you switch to render mode on your screen, it might actually try to render your texture into your model right now. So here, if you look at my screen, you can actually see that the texture has been added underneath all of my shading properties that I have already applied to my model. And the texture has been created on the surface, but it has been tiled at a very microscopic size. So it's actually, I think it's actually being tiled on every single polygon. So it's been repeated like, you know, hundreds of thousands of times across the surface of my model. It's seamless, which is great, but it's way too tiny. If I want to be able to see the detail of this texture, I need it to actually wrap around the model, not so much. So what we're going to do is we're going to change some of the options for how it wraps a texture around the model in order to change the way that it's viewable on it. Of course, cool thing you should notice immediately is that it still shows my material attributes over the top of the texture, right? So I can see my texture underneath, and I can see this kind of some of the gold and shine and reflection options that I have turned on my model currently, all based on this original material. So all of that is still happening at the same time that I'm using this. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to switch out of render mode and go back to material here. So back in material view, what I'm going to do here is we're going to change the way that it reads the texture on the model. And in order for us to change that, we have to do what's called marking a seam for it to understand how to wrap the texture around it to a specific place. That way it takes the whole image and wraps it around it once instead of applying it to every single teeny tiny polygon. So it's kind of like having like a seam like on a piece of clothes, like where the clothes join together. That's what we're going to do with the model. So when you pick a place to wrap the seam, usually you pick a place that you don't mind having like a vertical or a straight line show if your texture is not seamless. I'm going to put mine on the back of my model, so I'm going to switch to quad view. And I'm going to turn off my cyclorama for now. And I'm going to spin my model around in my top view. Just rotate it around so that I can see the back of it easily from the front view angle here. And then I'm going to switch my shading, or not my shading, but I'm going to switch to edit mode to do this next part. So once you can see the back of your model, kind of zoom in on it and then switch to edit mode. Again, you can wrap the texture on the front or the back. It's totally up to you where you want to see a seam line appear. But switch to edit mode and hit A a couple times until your model is completely deselected and black. Again, make sure you're in edit mode for this stage. And again, hit A a couple times to deselect everything. And then zoom in on your surface. And when you have a more complex model like we're starting with right now, this process can be a little tedious if you do this. But what we're going to do is switch, we're going to basically select a line of connected edges between a set of polygons to define where the seam line is going to be. So to do that, we're going to switch our selection cube down below to the edge selector, which is the bar that's over the little gray cube. And make sure this is just something in case you have it turned on. There's a little icon over here next to these cubes that looks like has little white circles on the corner of this little square icon. Make sure that's turned on. That way you don't see through your object. What that allows you to do is actually select straight through your object to the other side, and that can be a little crazy. So just make sure that button's turned on so you can't see through it. All right, but zoom in on your object so you can see kind of a straight line of polygons. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by selecting a long line of interconnected edges, just going straight down. So I'm just going to start with this one at the top, and I'm going to hold Shift so that I can make a long selection. Now you can select, and again, they should each be touching each other, okay? You don't want to make a line of these that are not connected. So make sure that you can see what you're doing. You may have to scroll up and down on your screen using the Shift and roll your mouse wheel function to continue to select down the side or the back or whatever of your model. And continue to hold down Shift when you do this, okay? Because that's adding to your selection as you go. It doesn't have to be a perfect straight line. It can be a little curvy if you need it to be. But the longer this line is, sometimes that helps to keep the texture from overstretching around parts of your object. Again, if it's a seamless texture, it should be a lot less obvious as to what's going to happen next. But once you've kind of developed a long line of sorts, again, it doesn't have to be terribly long as you have something to start with. And again, mine's just like I was saying, it's just a long interconnected line of selected edges. And that's using edge selection and holding down the Shift key to add to my selection as I click on new ones. And they should all be connected together. Once you've done that, excuse me, once you've done that, we are going to mark the seam. So to mark the seam on your object, go over to the left side of your screen where you have that vertical panel and select the little vertical tab that says Shading and UVs. And that's just with your vertical tabs on the left. So go to Shading and UVs. And after you do that, go down to where it says UVs and click on the button that says Mark Seam. And you should notice the seam line you created now has like a red highlight line across the top of it. And that just indicates in Blender that you have created a seam line on your model in order to understand how to wrap a UV texture around the form. All right, so once we've marked the seam, Now what we're going to do is actually select the whole model now. So hit A a couple times until your model completely highlights. And from that same little UV menu on the left, click on the black button that says Unwrap, and then use the option that says Unwrap at the top. Now this might take a second for it to calculate because your model might be very dense. And mine's taking a moment, so it might take a little bit longer on my model because it's pretty dense. Okay, now that it's done that, we're going to switch out of edit mode back to object mode, so hit tab. And when you hit tab, you should notice how it's chosen to wrap around the surface of your model. Now if you look at mine, this is pretty bizarre looking. So it's literally wrapped the texture back to the seam line. If you notice, the seam line is actually this little, again, it's this little vertical line that runs right up next to my model. And what it's done with the rest of it, however, is it has stretched quite literally the rest of the texture to fit around the model, but it's only tiled at one time. So every bit of the graphic imagery is completely stretched around it. Now, if you don't want it to appear that way, when using a seamless texture, we can actually get it to duplicate across the surface or tile so that we can actually render more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that now that I've wrapped it initially onto the model. So I'm going to go back over to my texture properties on the right. And I want you to slide down to the section in your texture properties that says mapping. So scroll down until you see mapping. I'm going to collapse some of these other menus so it's a little easier to see. But go down to mapping, and there's a section down here that says sizing or size. And if you change the X and Y values, make them higher, it will actually tile and add more textures onto your object. So I'm going to switch mine from 1.0 for X and Y, and I'm going to switch it to, let's say, 2.0. And now as I do that, it starts adding a little bit more, I start seeing a little bit more of the detail of the texture around my object. And again, you can amp that up, you can stretch it in one direction or whatever. But notice how texture wraps around a surface. Again, it's not perfect. You have to just realize that. It's all based on wherever you put that seam line. So whether you put it on the back, across the top, or across the bottom, that can dictate how it wraps the texture. You can also use the offset options that are listed there in that same mapping area to slide your texture across the surface of your object so that it can show different parts of it across the surface. Again, for X and Y specifically. And if you just click and drag on this on any of those values, it will slide and change it live on screen. So if you just click and drag on the sizing for X or Y, it will show you actively on screen how it's changing the effect of that texture on your model immediately, which is really nice to have the ability to do that. But you can immediately see how it affects the overall viewing of your model. Now you can switch back to rendered if you want to see how it looks in the final rendering of the surface when you combine all the surface materials together to get a more accurate view of what's happening. Now mine looks pretty bizarre because I have this gold thing going on and it's kind of overpowering my texture. But that's why it's good to preview in rendered mode to see if that original coloring scheme is actually helping it or distracting it. So if I turn off reflection, that actually helps immediately, and it looks a lot better already. All right, so I'm going to go back to material. This is how you can do a basic texture wrap around the model. You can play with the different options that are listed under mapping, like where it says projection. Flat is the most basic under the mapping attribute for your texture. Some of these other ones give you more bizarre looking changes to the way the model appears. If you switch it to sphere, for instance, I believe if you switch it to sphere and go to rendered, you'll see how it swirls the texture around the object instead of just putting it on it in kind of a plain-faced way.
Can you go over how to make the scene again?
Yeah, sure. Let me show just a couple more things before I go back to that. So last thing that I'll show you is that if you want to actually have your surface affected by the texture image itself, like to make the surface bumpy based on the sort of black and white shades that are inside the texture. If you go to the bottom of the texture property, there's a section called Influence. And under Influence, there's a section that says Geometry. And the little check boxes for geometry, there's one that's called Normal. And I'm going to switch to Render View to show you what it does whenever you change the normals. I believe it's normals that we do this with. So I'm going to go to Normal. And I'm going to slide up the factor for normals. And let me change my projection on my object. Let's see, was it normal or was it displacement? I always get these backwards. My bad. It's definitely not that one. Now, if you slide this up on geometry, come down here to where it says space down below for bump mapping, and switch from object space to texture space. So again, go down there at the bottom, switch to texture space. And what it allows you to do is actually use the surface, really what's the latent shading map that's built into your texture. So it looks at your texture and it looks at it in terms of being like measured on a grayscale. And anywhere there's highlights are more considered whites. Blacks will be blacks, or darks will be blacks, and then anything in between is gray. Highlights will pop away from the model and blacks will sort of recede. But that's why my model kind of looks crazy now. Because it's using that bump structure to define how it actually creates sort of bumps in the highlights and the shadows on the object. So it influences it. And it's all based on this little normal geometry slider right here. So the more reduced that is, the less heavy the effect appears. But it renders the illusion of the surface actually being displaced and bumpy. Kind of cool. And that sort of renders the illusion that your object actually has like a lot of surface texture that directly correlates with the actual image that you have wrapped around it. All right. Okay, so that was the last thing I wanted to show you with texturing. There are other things you can do, like earlier when I showed you guys how to apply like a color to a selected area on your object. You can actually do the same with textures too. Same method applies, and you can just do it from the texture menu where you go to edit mode, make a selection on your object, come back over to your material options, add a new material, and then add a new texture to that material, assign a new image, and it will paint in that image to fit that area. So you can have a lot of fun playing with that too. All right, so that's pretty much all we're going to cover in terms of dealing with the texture. Again, play around with it, have fun with it if it applies to your particular model's needs, especially if you need a base surface that's different than just a surface color. But that'll be all that we're going to cover for this particular exercise. So make sure to review as you need to. All right.